History of Cities. Episode 3 The Empire Strikes Back. We last left off the narrative with the Greek victory over the invading Persians in the First Greco Persian War. This had been a surprising, but not devastating, defeat to Darius's plans to conquer Greece. He fully planned to raise a much larger army and return soon to finish off the pesky Athenians and Spartans. However, the Greeks were spared this new offensive for the time being when a massive revolt broke out in the Persian provinces in Egypt. This revolt caused Darius to shift his focus south to Africa and gave the Greeks a chance to prepare themselves for what was surely an inevitable renewal of hostilities. Persian plans had a further wrench thrown into them when, while preparing to march on Egypt, Darius's health failed and he passed away. His son, Xerxes, was determined to continue his father's legacy, and so after crushing the revolt in Egypt, he began preparing for the massive invasion of Greece. All the vast resources of the mighty Persian Empire were called together, along with soldiers from 46 different allied nations. As per usual, sources from antiquity greatly overestimate the number of the Persians at the ridiculous number of 2.5 million. It is more likely that the invasion force was around 200,000 men strong. This is still 10 times the number sent on the first invasion, and the fleet that supported them was 1,200 triremes, roughly twice the size of the original fleet. Xerxes planned to march his army across the Hellespont, but was once again delayed by revolts in Egypt and Babylon. After almost a decade since the end of the First Greco-Persian War, the Persians finally crossed back over the Aegean and prepared to sweep aside the Greeks once and for all. So what had the Greeks done in this interbellum of almost 10 years to brace themselves for the second strike? Well, for one thing, the great hero of Marathon, Miltiades, got himself injured in a minor military campaign, and weeks later died from this wound. The loss of the great general certainly would seem to put the Greeks on the back foot early on. Luckily, there was a man to step up and take the place of Miltiades. This man was named Themistocles, and I think he is important enough for us to take a brief aside to dive deeper into his history. Themistocles was an Athenian politician and general who had benefited greatly from the new democratic nature of Athenian politics. He was not born into the aristocracy, and so cultivated his base of power among the lower-class citizens of Athens. Under this new system, Themistocles quickly rose to become one of the most powerful politicians in the city. As a populist, he was often opposed by the elitist nobility in the government, especially in his attempts to strengthen the navy. He believed that the coming war against the Persians would be decided just as much at sea as it would on land. Furthermore, a strong Greek presence in the Aegean would dissuade any future invasions. To this end, he convinced the Athenians to build a fleet of 200 triremes that would play a pivotal role in the coming wars. As was common for many politicians in that day, Themistocles supplemented his political career with a military one. He joined the army at Marathon and led one of the center columns that was initially pushed back by the Persians. After the battle, Themistocles continued to work in politics during the interbellum, but he knew a second invasion was coming and planned to lead his newly built fleet to defend his home. That is as much as I can talk about Themistocles for now, but I wanted to highlight his story not just because he will play an important role in the coming Second Greco-Persian War, but because he embodies a historical device that I want to quickly touch on. Themistocles, as Miltiades, as Xerxes, as countless others, are examples of great men of history. These great men are usually used to show a top-down perspective of history that supposes that the masses are usually inert and that history has progressed through the titanic individual efforts of extraordinary men. The ancient sources we are drawing from at this time were completely convinced of this theory of individuals driving history. This is in contrast to more modern theories of history, like the idea that it is small events that build pressure until a limit is reached and the masses explode into action, and that so-called great men are simply swept up in the mass movement. As we move through our narrative, I hope to find a good balance between constructing a coherent and entertaining story using recognizable and relatable figures such as Themistocles, and maintaining a sense of historical realism that takes into account the underlying motivating factors that truly move history. Returning to the narrative, following in his father's example, Xerxes sent emissaries to each of the Greek city-states, demanding submission to the Persian king. In response to this portent of invasion, a congress of resolute city-states, led by Athens and Sparta, convened in Corinth. This can be seen as the culmination of the Greek solidarity that had been building since the Ionian Revolt, and was a watershed moment in the Hellenic world, as rivals and enemies among the disconnected Greek world bound themselves together in alliance against a foreign threat. While it is most likely that the only topic discussed by this Congress was the matter of defense of Greece, it is also possible that the idea of a permanent confederation of Greek cities or even an entirely united Greek nation was born during these meetings. The Congress met for its second session in 480 BC, where they decided upon the strategy of holding the Vale of Tempe, a narrow gorge that divides northern and southern Greece. Upon arriving at the Vale, the king of Macedon, Alexander I, warned the Greeks that the gorge was not as defensible as they had previously assumed, and that Xerxes' massive army had already crossed into northern Greece. As a brief aside, it is interesting that this knowledge was given by Alexander, since Macedon was a fully incorporated vassal of Persia since the First Greco Persian War, and some sources claim that Alexander was loyal to Xerxes. What the reason for his betrayal is, we can only speculate. After retreating from the Vale of Tempe, Themistocles proposed that the allied forces hold a different narrow pass, and to also use the fleet to block the Straits of Artemisium, so that the Persian army would not be able to circumvent the pass. The pass Themistocles suggested was of course the famous one that could be held by a small force against incredible numbers, Thermopylae. Now, unlike how the propaganda tells it, the pass was not only held by 300 brave Spartans and their king, but instead by a force of around 7,000 Greeks from a multitude of allied cities. The Spartans weren't even a plurality of this group, though, being professional soldiers as opposed to citizen levies, they likely contributed to the defense more relative to their numbers. Ironically, the Persians were set to arrive at Thermopylae during the same festival that the Spartans had used as an excuse to not fight during the Battle of Marathon. Perhaps because the Spartans viewed Xerxes as a more serious threat, or perhaps because they thought they wouldn't be able to get away with using that same excuse twice, the Spartans would this time send troops to aid in the defense. Similar to the Battle of Marathon, the Greek commanders chose a spot to engage the Persians where the terrain would accentuate their advantages and nullify the enemy's style of war. The phalanx was nearly invulnerable in the narrow pass, protected from flanking maneuvers by cliffs and protected from arrow volleys by their heavy shields. In this way, the Greeks were able to stave off 2 days of relentless Persian onslaughts. They even managed to defeat the Persian immortals, who were considered the most fearsome and until then unstoppable force in the ancient world. However, on the second day, the Persians discovered a mountain path that would allow them to flank behind the Greek position. This path was either shown to them by a traitorous Greek, according to Herodotus, or simply found by the Persian scouts, according to less dramatic accounts. Either way, the 1,000 Greek soldiers guarding the path quickly ran away when they saw the Persians advancing on them. They had the good grace to at least warn the rest of the allies that the position was lost and allowed for most of the Greeks to retreat. 2,000 men, including the Spartan king, stayed behind to give them time to get away and to inflict as much damage on the Persian army as they could, but were inevitably slaughtered. At the same time as Thermopylae, the navies of the two sides engaged at Artemisium. There is a reason the Greek storytellers and historians prefer to emphasize Thermopylae over Artemisium, and that is because the Greeks can hardly take credit for defending the straits for 3 days when the weather did most of the work. First, before the Persian fleet even arrived at Artemisium, a storm destroyed nearly 400 of their 1,200 ships. Then, when they sent 200 ships to flank and trap the Greek fleet, another storm wrecked them. So after losing a significant portion of their fleet, the two sides finally met in limited engagements over the same 2 days that the Allies held the pass at Thermopylae. The loss in marines and ships for both sides was relatively equal, but the much smaller Greek fleet could not absorb these losses in the same way the Persians could. Compounding this defeat was the arrival of news on the third day that the land battle had been lost and the Persian army now controlled all of Boeotia. Themistocles' plan relied on both the land and the sea being held by the Allies, and so the fleet decided to retreat to the island of Salamis to regroup and decide the next course of action. On the way to Salamis, the fleet stopped off at Athens to help evacuate the population before the now unopposed Persian army came and sacked the city. Xerxes' destruction of Athens was complete and merciless. For too long, the city had stood as a beacon of democracy and defiance against the Persian Empire, and now the symbol had to be erased. However, Xerxes was well aware that the Athenians would return and rebuild the city if he did not completely subjugate them during this campaign. In order to do that, he needed to defeat the remaining allied fleet at Salamis to remove any chance at a military resistance to Persian rule. Unfortunately for Xerxes, his victories at Thermopylae and Artemisium had come at a much higher cost than he had been predicting. It could be said that the overwhelming size of the Persian invasion force had in fact been their undoing, as they were more careless about tactics and strategy, leading to disadvantageous engagements that had sapped their forces. Now the Persians were deep in enemy territory, and were facing the possibility of being trapped if their fleet sustained significant losses. Thus, Xerxes and his generals were anxious to finish the campaign and return to the safety of Asia. Themistocles likewise saw the precariousness of the situation and sought to goad the Persian fleet into an engagement where he and the allies could destroy it, and therefore end the invasion. To this end, Themistocles maneuvered the fleet into the Straits of Salamis to bait the Persians. Once again, the Persians failed to see that the small width of engagement removed the advantage of numbers, and they took the bait. In the subsequent battle, nearly 200 Persian ships were destroyed or captured, effectively giving the Greeks complete control over the naval portion of the war. With the loss of his navy, Xerxes was terrified that the Greeks would be able to destroy the temporary bridges he had used to cross the Hellespont, and thus trap him on the west side of the Aegean. To avoid this disaster, Xerxes and a majority of his army beat a hasty retreat back to Asia, leaving only Mardonius and a small army to finish the invasion. As the campaign season ended, the Persians decided to hold up in Boeotia, letting the Athenians return to the mainland. During this downtime, the tenuous alliance began experiencing friction, as the Athenians believed that their city had been abandoned because their allies did not care about protecting them. This friction was due to the fact that until recently, most of the cities in the alliance hated each other and were only working together because they feared the Persians more than they hated their neighbors. In fact, the two most powerful delegations, Athens and Sparta, would never really see eye to eye, but that story is for a later episode. The Persians were the first to offer peace terms through the neutral delegate Alexander of Macedon. Perhaps they no longer felt they could complete the conquest militarily, and now just wanted to get out of Greece with their lives and as many concessions as they could eke out. But the Greeks, feeling themselves to be in a much better position, rejected the terms of peace, and the Athenians retreated back to Salamis in preparation for renewed hostilities. From Salamis, they demanded the Spartans to finally prove to the rest of Greece that their reputation as the greatest warriors around was not just boastful. The Spartans, never ones to back down from a fight, unless you count the 2 times they had used the same festival as an excuse, raised an army to finally push the Persians out of Greece. Mardonius was more cautious at this time than any previous Persian commander had been. It was likely that he was no longer confident he could defeat the Greeks by sheer numbers, and sought to fight on terrain that would allow him to use the tactics that had proved effective in the Ionian revolt. As he searched for an open plain where his cavalry could flank the phalanx, the Greek commander Pausanias was searching for uneven ground where the Greek hoplites would have the advantage. This resulted in an almost comical situation as the 2 armies danced around each other, neither wanting to engage on the opponent's terms. Finally, Pausanias saw that they were getting nowhere while tiring out their troops, and ordered a retreat to the defensive positions away from the Persians. Something went wrong during this retreat, possibly because it was done at night and the different allied regiments lost contact with each other, but it ended up with Greek forces divided and confused. Mardonius saw this confusion as the perfect chance to engage the enemy, and took the initiative. However, the Greeks, while divided, were still in the hills, so it would come down to a contest of infantry, and in this aspect the hoplites were far superior. Just like at Marathon, the heavy armor and tight formations of the Greek lines allowed them to cut through the Persians until they reached Mardonius and killed the Persian commander. With the loss of their commander, the bulk of the Persian army fled all the way back to the Persian holdings in northern Greece. Those who did not flee all the way up north held up in a camp near the battlefield. The Greeks found them here and showed no mercy as they slaughtered the camp, leaving no army to oppose them in all of southern Greece. I won't go over the casualty numbers for this battle, because frankly the sources are a mess, but the common consensus is that the Persians lost nearly 5 times as many men as the Greeks did, despite outnumbering them and being the ones who initiated the battle. In the end, the hoplite infantry and high ground advantage the Greeks held were decisive factors. In a mirror to the battles of Thermopylae and Artemisium, a naval battle occurred around the same time, in which the Allied fleet was able to mop up all the remaining Persian ships and take complete control over the seas. Unlike at Thermopylae and Artemisium, the battles of Plataea and Mycale were absolute Greek victories that marked a turning point in the war. Now it was time for the Allies to go on the offensive to drive the invaders from their land forever. As a boon to the alliance's plans to take the fight to the invaders, the destruction of the Persian fleet and routing of their army inspired the Ionian cities in Anatolia to renew their revolt. The ascendant Greek fleet's first goal was to prevent the crossing of another Persian army into Europe, so they set sail to destroy the temporary bridges Xerxes had built. When they arrived at the area where the bridges had been, they found that they had already been destroyed by the fleeing Persians. With this job done, the Allies sought to secure both sides of the crossing by first besieging the city of Sestos on the eastern side of the Hellespont. This siege took much longer than expected, but eventually the Persian garrison was forced to flee the city, but were eventually captured by the Greeks. After this siege, the fleet went on a little side trip to the island of Cyprus, where they raided the Persian-controlled cities, but did not try and take control of the island, as even with their naval power being unrivaled, it would have proved too much of a challenge to hold. From Cyprus, the fleet set out to retake the western side of the Hellespont, and finally, we get to see the return of Greek control to our city of Byzantium. Byzantium was of dual importance to the Greeks, as once it was in their hands, it not only prevented any future invasions from the east, it also opened up trade routes with tribes settled around the Black Sea. To hold the city, the Allies placed the victorious commander of the Battle of Plataea, Pausanias, in command. The relationship between Pausanias and the people of Byzantium was strained due to conflicting philosophies. Pausanias was a Spartan general and thus prized strict discipline in obedience to authority over diplomacy and politicking. This grated against the more democratic desires of the Byzantines, who had just dealt with the tyranny of Persian subjugation. The complaints of the Byzantines to the alliance led to Pausanias being recalled to face trial for alleged collusion with the Persians, of which he was acquitted. A leading voice in the call to remove Pausanias was our old friend Themistocles, who saw the austere Spartan general as a tyrant in the making, whose authoritarian views aligned him more to the Persian way of governance than to the Greek way. With the removal of Pausanias, control of Byzantium fell to the Athenians, and the Spartans began to grow weary of the war. In the eyes of the Spartans, the fall of Byzantium had marked the logical conclusion of the campaign against the Persians. The entirety of Greece now lay in Greek hands. The Ionian cities in Asia Minor were under Greek control, and further conquest east would be impossible to hold, and thus was not worth the trouble. In fact, the Spartans believed all Greek holdings in Asia should be abandoned and the inhabitants of the Ionian cities should return to Greece proper, as Persia was likely to continue retaking these cities whenever possible. The Athenians, however, did not want to abandon these cities, who had originally been colonized by their citizens. Furthermore, Athens was itching for a punitive campaign against Xerxes to punish him for his arrogant invasion and destruction of their city. This friction between Sparta and Athens would eventually lead to the splitting of the alliance in the year 477 BC. The Spartans and the cities under their sphere of influence departed from the campaign, while the rest of the Greek allies convened on the island of Delos to form a new alliance. This new alliance would not have a powerful counterbalance to Athens, as the first alliance had had with Sparta, so it would be utterly dominated by the Athenians. The dominance of Athens is shown by the name of the alliance formerly being the First Athenian Alliance. It is more commonly known as the Delian League or the Athenian Empire, due to Athens's unrivaled political power in the body. The stated goal of this league was revenge against the Persians. The league set out to build up their army for the coming campaign by demanding each member city either send troops or money. After about a year or so of preparation, they were ready to launch their offensive against the Persians. They began by sweeping away any Persian garrisons still left in Greece. In 476 BC, the Greek force, under the command of Miltiades' son Cimon, struck Eion. Eion was a strategically important city in Thrace and the first step in purging the entire country of invaders. Following the fall of Eion, Cimon sailed his army south to the island of Skyros, which was not occupied by Persia, but had become a pirate haven from which marauding ships set out to harass members of the League. The pacification of Skyros was followed by a campaign in Asia Minor of recruitment at sword point. Cimon took his army from city to city, demanding they join the Delian League and provide support to the campaign. Most Greek cities had either already joined the League, as in the case of Lesbos, Samos, and Chios, or did not resist the call. In the midst of this campaign, Cimon received word that a large Persian fleet was amassing at the city of Aspendos. This information was not a great surprise to the Greeks, who had met very little Persian resistance so far, despite being in Asia for a number of years. In fact, it was probably just surprising to them that it had taken this long for the Persians to begin mounting anything resembling a defense. The reason it had taken so long to build this fleet was a problem that all large empires, and especially large empires during this time, had. The problem was that the bureaucratic infrastructure was inept at holding much control in the empire's vast territories, which in turn made raising armies difficult and made localized rebellions commonplace. Dealing with these internal issues hampered the Persians' ability to respond to outside aggression in a timely manner. Cimon decided to preempt this counterattack by sailing a fleet of 200 ships to the furthest east Greek city in Asia Minor, Phaselis. The citizens of this city were not as accepting of Cimon's demands as others had been, and the Greeks set about raiding their lands to show that membership in the League was not optional. Eventually, They capitulated, and Simon had removed the risk of the Persians mounting an effective counteroffensive by capturing the most important naval base in the region. The League sought to press their advantage by attacking the Persian fleet that was still gathered around the mouth of the Eurymedon River. As they were spotted, the Persians began retreating into the river, hoping that they could evade the Greek fleet until their expected reinforcements could arrive. However, the Greeks steadily gained on the Persians, and eventually they decided to give battle before they were overtaken. A quick battle ensued, in which the Persian lines were broken, and before they were annihilated, the Persians ground their ships on the bank so they could link up with their army that was camped nearby. Simon was eager to continue forward and pressed his soldiers to chase the enemy onto land. When they caught up with the Persians, a pitched battle between the two sides was ultimately won by the better equipped Greeks. After defeating the land army in the Battle of Eurymedon, Simon returned to the river to burn the ships the Persians had left behind. He then turned to face the reinforcing fleet the Phoenicians had sent and completely destroyed them. These battles marked the end of any possible Persian reconquest of the Asian Greek cities for the time being, and removed the threat of a third Persian invasion of Greece. The removal of these threats led to a brief period of peace, where the Greeks held complete dominance at sea and the Persians made no attempt at a major land campaign. This peace was broken when the League launched an opportunistic campaign in the Persian territory in Egypt that I will not go into great detail for because it seems to be a little outside the scope of our narrative, and the story of the Second Greco Persian War is beginning to get quite lengthy. I will simply say that of all of Persia's peripheral territories, Egypt was the most troublesome and was often in revolt. One such revolt took place in 460 BC, in which the revolting king asked for aid from the Delian League. The League sent an army to assist them in their fight against the Persians, but a disastrous campaign led to the Athenians losing around 50,000 men and 250 ships. This campaign coincided with a conflict that had broken out in Greece between Sparta and Athens that we will delve further into in the next episode. A temporary ceasefire in this inter-Greek conflict freed up enough troops for a final campaign against the Persians in 451 BC. This campaign would take place on the island of Cyprus, where Simon led a siege on the city of Kition. This siege was a failure after the Greeks ran out of food and Simon succumbed to sickness. Simon left final instructions for his fleet to retreat to the city of Salamis in Cyprus. In an act of historical comedy, the commanders of the Greek army did a Weekend at Bernie's style play where they did not inform the rank and file of Simon's death and continued to issue orders under his name. So the credit of leadership in the coming battles of Salamis and Cyprus would go to a man who had been dead for a month. The battles of Salamis and Cyprus were a combined naval and land conflict, where the Persian fleet attacked the Greeks, but were ultimately defeated, allowing the Greeks to complete their retreat all the way home. These battles were the last major engagements in the 50-year conflict that had been the Greco-Persian Wars. There is a fair bit of disagreement between sources whether there was any actual formal peace treaty signed, with none of the contemporary historians ever mentioning it. However, the later sources that do mention a treaty usually describe the terms in a similar manner, meaning that they are at least following a common source, whether it is true or false. In general, the terms were that all the Greek cities in Asia Minor were to be autonomous from Persian rule, so no more Persian tyrants. They also set the boundaries for where the Persians were allowed to send their armies or navies. The sources used different units to measure how close the armies were allowed to come, with some marking the Halys River as the boundary, some saying a day's journey by horse from the Aegean, and some saying 3 days' journey to the Aegean by foot. There was concurrence on the naval boundary that the furthest eastern Greek city that Simon had conquered was the limit on the southern coast of Anatolia, and the northern entrance to the Bosphorus Strait was the limit on the northern coast. In return, the Athenians promised not to send any more armies into the lands controlled by Persia. These terms were quite lenient, as Persia had already allowed the Ionian cities to use their own laws since the Ionian Revolt, and were in no position to challenge the Greeks at sea, so what would have been the use of sailing warships into Greek waters? In the end, the Persian king Artaxerxes, son of Xerxes, was happy to sign the peace and put the war to rest so he could focus on the chronic internal issues plaguing the empire. I would like to do a big recap of the entire series of conflicts between the Greeks and Persians that brought dramatic changes to the Hellenic world and by extension to the Byzantine world. When the Ionian Revolt broke out in 499 BC, all of the Greek city-states on both sides of the Aegean were loosely connected through a shared language and a few cultural markers. Even the most powerful actors in Greece, Sparta and Athens, only had small networks of influence around their immediate neighbors. Apart from the Athenians, all Greeks were ruled by their local king or tyrant, whether that ruler was Greek or Persian. The revolt was a result of the Greeks' distaste for the fairly heavy-handed rule of the Persian tyrants in Ionia and northern Greece. This distaste of foreign rule helped to begin solidifying the proto-nationalist idea of a united Greek people being ruled by Greeks. The failure of the revolt was ultimately inconsequential as Greek solidarity endured. The Persian reaction to the revolt in 492 BC, which we called the First Greco Persian War, could have successfully smothered this nascent Greek nation had it been victorious at Marathon. But they were instead defeated, and the delay allowed for the ties between the Greeks to calcify. When the Second Persian offensive finally came in 480 BC, instead of picking off isolated Greek cities as they had done before, the Persians were faced by a much larger and more determined coalition. This resulted in the defeat of a massive Persian army and the complete ascendancy of the Greek navy. The following counteroffensive purged the Persians from all the Greek cities on the east and west of the Aegean, but disagreements on whether to continue the campaign broke the alliance between Athens and Sparta. After the split, the Delian League continued their campaign against the Persians in Asia Minor and Egypt until the year 449. In the aftermath of this series of wars, the Hellenic world was more united than it had ever been, and there would be another 50 years until they faced the mighty Persian Empire again. In the meantime, the rising power of the Athenian Empire had made its rival Sparta wary, and next time we will see how Byzantium was once again vied over by two larger powers in the greater conflict between them. But for now, I want to end this episode by again zooming in to how Byzantium had changed during this series of conflicts. They had begun as a Persian subject under the rule of a foreign tyrant, until they were conquered by Histiaeus and forced to join the Ionian Revolt. They were then recaptured by the Persians in the prelude to the First Greco-Persian Wars, when King Darius sent his son-in-law Mardonius to subjugate northern Greece. In the interbellum and subsequent war, Byzantium was a non-participant until the Greeks were able to push the Persians back to Asia and retake the city. Retaking Byzantium was of particular importance to the Greeks, since its strategic position, combined with their complete ownership of the seas, opened up trade between the Black Sea and the Greek cities. However, things were not quite peaceful after the return of the city to Greek rulership, as they became a political battleground between Sparta and Athens, which foreshadowed the coming First Peloponnesian War. Next time, we will be going over this de facto Greek civil war, and as always, if you have any questions or think I missed anything, please feel free to email me at hofcpod.cast@gmail.com or DM me on Twitter at HOFC_podcast. Thank you for listening to this episode, and please join me next time for the history of Byzantium.